racing news about we really have to change. Don't depress them to the point where they are paralyzed and don't find the energy to act as we all must. And all of those have factored into the decisions that I make in reducing the slideshow to a very short version. I have an even shorter version that's online now at the TED.com site. It's about a 25-minute version. This one is, I don't know, we'll see how long it takes. Mario said it's scheduled for an hour, but I think it'll come in less than an hour. The one that you eventually give will probably be shorter still. But the reason I'm going through this right now is that I want to remind you that you will have access to the long version and the short version, and you have been given the opportunity and the knowledge of how to substitute some slides. For example, the hundreds of people here from the Philippines may wish to use more of the slides that are directly relevant to the Philippines in your slideshows. But if you do that, please bear in mind that you may have to remove some other slides in order to make room for them. Also, if you are from Indonesia or Bangladesh or Nigeria or some other nation, we do have slides that illustrate floods, storms, droughts, solar installations, wind installations in your country, and you will be able to substitute specific slides and examples that are relevant to your individual nation. But again, if you do that, which you probably will want to do, bear in mind that you will probably want to remove some of the others. And in the sessions later today, you will have discussions about how to do that. Another point before I begin, and this is directly related to the HOPE budget. I have found in giving the shorter version of the slideshow that it's extremely useful and kind to the audience to warn them in advance that there will be some difficult news to absorb in the first part of the slideshow, but alert them in advance that hope is on the way and that if they get through the first part without just becoming without succumbing to despair, that there is a lot of hope. And that is the reality. We are winning this. We are going to prevail. I know that. I believe that deeply in my heart. But it matters a lot how fast we prevail. And the political will, the will to act that's necessary to win this great historic struggle rapidly enough is partly fed by a sobering awareness of how dangerous this threat is. And so the presentation would not have integrity if we fail to tell people how dangerous it is. So there's a balance. You have to walk a fine line. Make sure that you convey the seriousness of this challenge. We as human beings have never faced anything like this, certainly not on a global basis. And so building the conviction in the hearts of those who are listening to you and watching your presentation requires an effort to, and a successful effort to communicate exactly how serious it is without turning them off, without turning off their ability to hope. So I usually begin by saying that there will be a lot of positive news in the second part of the slideshow. Now, final point before I begin, and I'll do this as if I'm giving the short version to an audience for the first time. I have come to use a particular structure for the short version of the slideshow that I think makes it easier for most audiences to follow all the way from the beginning to the end. And I usually begin by saying there are only 3 questions that we have to answer still for the climate crisis. The first question is, do we have to change? And the answer, as you will see and have seen, is yes. The second question is, can we change? Because if we have to change and we don't have the ability to change, people will not want to hear anything else from you. Because if we have to change and we can't, then that's a formula for anxiety and stress and despair and just curling up in a fetal position. But the answer, fortunately, as you've already seen, to the question, can we change, is yes, we can. It's a fantastic new development, and it's very exciting, and it comes with tremendous economic opportunity. And then after must we change, can we change, comes the final question, the third question, will we change? And the evidence, particularly since Paris, is that yes, is the answer to that third question as well. But we all know that since the answer, since the speed with which we change is important, that answer is still to be finally determined. Yes, we will change, but how fast will we change? So that is the structure. Okay, so with that as preface, let's see how we do here. We are now facing a climate crisis that is without any precedent in human history. This is the Earth we all share. It is now endangered because, as this image from space shows, the sky is not the vast and limitless expanse it appears to be when we stand on the ground and look upwards. It is actually a very thin shell of atmosphere surrounding the planet. And the total volume of air molecules in that thin space is small enough that we, as human beings, with our powerful industries and all of the activities that particularly rely on carbon-based fuels, are capable of filling up this thin shell of atmosphere with a lot of heat-trapping gases that are threatening the climate balance that is important to the flourishing of humankind. This is now, in effect, the open sewer for the gaseous waste of our industrial civilization as it is currently organized. We are now putting 110 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into it. And so, as you know, when the energy from the sun comes into the Earth's atmosphere, it warms the planet, it gives life to the plants, and the plants give life to the animals, and some of the heat is radiated back into space, and some of it, because of the natural greenhouse gas layer, is trapped, and that keeps the temperatures on our planet within comfortable boundaries that are absolutely perfect for humans and the other animals and all the plants and ecosystems. But because we are putting 110 million tons every day of heat-trapping pollution into that shell of atmosphere, we are thickening it, and more of the outgoing infrared heat is trapped, and that is driving the temperature of our planet upwards beyond the boundaries that are healthy for life on this planet. And there are many causes of the man-made global warming pollution, and I'm certainly not going to go through every one of them. We're going to concentrate on the main one, which is the burning of dirty carbon-based fossil fuels. But as we undertake this historic challenge, it is important to recognize that Other activities besides the burning of carbon fuels are also significant causes. The way we pursue agriculture is very important. Actually, diet is also connected. The stabilizing of human population around the world, which is a success story unfolding in slow motion, is also important. The management of the oceans, mining and transportation, and the melting of the permafrost in the Arctic is now beginning to release a lot of methane gas. So all of these causes are important. But we're going to focus on the main one, which is the fact that we still rely on dirty carbon-based fuels for 85% of all the energy that we have in regular use in our global civilization. So now there are only 3 questions remaining about the climate crisis. And the first one is, do we have to change? Must we change? Actually, the burning of fossil fuels has been one of the keys to the development of this elaborate global civilization that has reduced poverty and raised standards of living and has brought so many benefits to the people of our planet. And we never intended the unfavorable consequences of all the waste products associated with burning these fuels. And so naturally, the first question, must we change, is one that causes some people to say, well, it looks like it's going to be hard to change. We rely on them so extensively. But in answering that first question, I will necessarily be giving you some evidence of why we really do have to change that is a little bit hard to hear and see at times. But hold on, because the answers to the second and third questions, can we change, is the second question, and then will we change? The answers to those second and third questions really involves very positive news. There is an overwhelming amount of hope. So hang on as we talk about the reasons why we do have to change. First of all, the accumulated amount of man-made global warming pollution in the Earth's atmosphere now traps as much extra heat energy in the Earth system every day as would be released by 400,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every 24 hours. It is a big planet, but that is a lot of energy. And especially when you multiply that amount of energy by 400,000 times every single day, it has a huge impact on the temperature and the climate. And so let's look at some of those impacts. This is the only really complicated slide in this entire presentation, so bear with me for a moment. This is a representation of normal temperature distribution. And the scientists who did this study, led by Jim Hansen, took the period from 1951 to 1980, and the white represent normal days, the blue represent cooler than normal days, the red represents warmer than normal days, 1951 to 1980. So in the decade of the 1980s, all of those temperatures shifted to the right, and for the first time we saw the appearance here in the lower right of a statistically significant number of extremely hot days. Then in the 1990s, it shifted further to the warm side, and in the last 10 years, now we see that the number of extremely hot days are more numerous than cooler than average days. In fact, the extremely hot days are now almost 150 times more common than they were just 30 years ago. And these are the days that are most associated with the extreme climate-related weather events that we will discuss. We still have cold days, we still have winters, we still have some extremely cold days, but they are much less frequent now, and the whole temperature range is now dominated by warmer than average days and extremely hot days. You can see in the measurement of atmospheric surface temperatures over the period from 1880, when we first started measuring them with instruments, what is happening. We are now breaking many records. In fact, 14 of the 15 hottest years ever recorded have been within the last 16 years. And the hottest of all was last year. This year is predicted to be hotter still. And these extreme temperatures are now continuing month by month. Last month, February, saw the hottest February in history, the 372nd month in a row hotter than the 20th century average. And the amount by which February broke that record was larger than any month in the 1,662 months going all the way back to when measurements began. So this is continuing to become more threatening. And as a result, we're seeing the consequences of higher temperatures on people, animal, plants, ecosystems. Last summer in India, more than 2,300 people died in that heat wave. More than 1,200 people in neighboring Pakistan later in the same summer. But on a global basis, even though we've just been talking about atmospheric temperatures now, 93% of all this extra heat energy goes into the oceans. And that has dramatic consequences because most of our planet is covered by the oceans, and the scientists are now able to measure ocean temperatures much more precisely now. In the deep ocean, the mid-ocean, the first few hundred meters of the ocean. And this too is accelerating. Half of this increase has occurred in the last 19 years. Now, this has consequences. The first order of consequences is that the warmer oceans make ocean-based storms much stronger. Super Typhoon Haiyan, or Yolanda as it is described in the Philippines, crossed over parts of the Pacific Ocean that were 3 degrees Celsius warmer than normal, and it became the most powerful and most destructive ocean-based storm ever to make landfall. The consequences were horrific. Many thousands of people were killed, and more than 4 million people were left homeless. The loss of life was very tragic, and what a blessing it was that Pope Francis came to Tacloban, to the ground zero of that tragedy, and delivered a very powerful message, one that was later amplified in his encyclical. And one of his main points is that the gravest effects of the climate crisis are visited upon the poorest people. This is true everywhere in the world, and a lesson worth remembering. In the United States, the most powerful hurricane to ever hit New York City crossed areas of the Atlantic that were 5 degrees Celsius warmer than normal and flooded much of Manhattan Island, destroyed the coastline of New Jersey, flooded even the 9/11 memorial site. So the second order consequences of warming the oceans as much as we are include the disruption of the water cycle, which begins with the evaporation of water vapor off the oceans into the sky. This feeds much more moisture into the atmospheric rivers that then are pulled over the land masses, and when storm conditions trigger a release of that moisture, the downpours are much larger. Just look at the rain coming in over Tucson, Arizona, as it splashes off the city. Just yesterday, in the U.S. state of Louisiana, there was what the scientists referred to as a rain bomb. 2 feet of rain over 3 days have caused the largest flooding in the history of that region of the south central United States. But these events are occurring with regularity now. Almost every night on the television news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. We are seeing increasing floods. Here is one in Chile last year. You will see a warehouse float by. People are not used to the kinds of tragedies these floods are causing. Here are oil tanker cars coming by. This is one of many events in Europe. This is in a city in Spain. called Adra. You could call this the running of the cars and trucks instead of the running of the bulls. In India, in China, in places all across the world, we are seeing unprecedented flooding. This one affected 6 million people in the state of Sichuan in China. Now, the country that experiences the single most weather-related disasters is not China or India or Brazil. It is actually the Philippines. And so the Philippines is in many ways more vulnerable than almost any other nation. We are seeing the effect on agriculture of these repeated storms. The Philippines are, of course, in the typhoon belt, with Visayas in the center of that belt. And so when the ocean temperatures increase and more moisture fills the storms and the wind speeds grow stronger, the Philippines are impacted more than almost any other nation. But on a worldwide basis, the insurance industry is telling us this is a global crisis. The losses are mounting. And they're not only financial losses, they are losses of people. They're losses to families. And there is an important point to be made about the causal relationship between the climate crisis and all these extreme weather events. Some people say, well, storms have many causes, and it's true. But as the leading scientists are now telling us, there is not only linear cause and effect, one cause, one effect, there is systemic cause and effect. Put simply, and most people with common sense understand this already, when we put much more water vapor into the sky and much more heat energy into the atmospheric system, every storm is different. A storm that might have been a strong storm in the past because of the extra loading of water and energy into the system can become a catastrophic storm. And it is the catastrophic storms that are increasing so rapidly in number. Moreover, the same heat that causes this evaporation of water vapor from the ocean also pulls the soil moisture out of the land. That is why at the same time we have more floods and mudslides, we have longer and deeper droughts. The Philippines, like my country, the United States, has been experiencing both more storms and floods, more droughts, both of which damage agriculture and damage people's lives. Farmers in the Philippines worry about the unpredictability of rainfall, and they worry even more in many provinces about the increasing long droughts. The historic drought over the previous 2 years in Brazil really caused a water rationing all across the country, almost 20% of the population. In southern Africa now, I could show many examples, but I'm going to go to a third consequence, because when the vegetation is dried out along with the land, we become more vulnerable to fires, and the climate crisis creates more lightning. So we have seen more fires all around the world. One of the biggest and most destructive in the last few years was in Russia. It killed 55,000 people, but it also illustrated the interconnections among us all in the global economy, because 4 months after these fires took place across Russia and Central Asia, all of Russia's grain was pulled off the world markets, and food prices around the world went to a record high level for the second time in 3 years, and there were food riots in 60 countries, and 30 countries on the other occasion. Food riots in India, in South America, and significantly in North Africa. The Arab Spring began when a food vendor set himself on fire, and the video enraged and mobilized people to start the Arab Spring. Again, there were many factors involved, but the record high food prices were significant in causing the political disruptions. What about the Eastern Mediterranean? They are now suffering a climate-related drought that is the worst drought in almost 1,000 years, and if the records were better, it might go back longer than that. Syria, We are seeing farmers lose their land because of the drought. The climate-related drought that began in 2006 in Syria destroyed 60% of their farms, killed 80% of their livestock, and drove 1.5 million climate refugees into the cities of Syria, where they collided with 1.5 million refugees from the Iraq War, and contributed to the opening of the gates of hell in Syria that many people are now trying to close once again. There are many countries in this world that have difficulty governing themselves in the best of times, and many are improving. But when the climate-related extremes put extra burdens on them, then they lose their capacity to control events. The refugees that flow from the Middle East and North Africa are fleeing violence, they're fleeing political oppression, but they're also fleeing conditions that have been caused in significant measure by the climate-related historic drought. The U.S. Defense Department has long warned about the security implications of the climate crisis, and they've warned about these refugee flows. They've warned about food shortages because of the impact of the climate crisis on the growing of food crops, and water shortages. And they've also warned about pandemic disease, because the warming of the climate and the extra soil moisture is now contributing to the spread of many tropical diseases to latitudes where these diseases have been unknown or never a problem in the past. The transportation revolution has contributed to this spread, but think for a moment about the Zika virus, which is the latest of these. It is one of the factors that has led one of the most distinguished medical journals in the world, The Lancet, to say climate change is now a medical emergency for our world. The struggle between people and microbes has been going on since our species began. But what works in our favor is cooler nights, colder winters, and conditions that inhibit the spread of mosquitoes and ticks and other vectors that carry these microbes. We now have to recognize the medical emergency connected to the climate crisis. And we have to recognize as well that it's not only the human species that is suffering. We are now in the midst of what the biologists call the sixth great extinction. We are in danger in this century, during the lifetimes of children alive today, of losing 1/2 of all the living species that God has created on this earth to share it with us. Do we not have a moral responsibility to stop such a catastrophe affecting the web of life of which we are a part? We are seeing this same phenomena in the oceans. And by the way, this has practical implications for fishermen in the Philippines, whose maximum catch could be reduced by 50% over the next 35 years. These are moral imperatives, but they are moral imperatives that also have a very powerful economic dimension. The land-based animal and plant species are now moving toward the poles at an average rate of 15 feet per day. Let's talk about the poles for a moment. This last December at the North Pole, in the middle of the long, dark polar night winter, a very powerful storm that brought heat, energy, and moisture from the tropics all the way across North America to the Arctic raised the temperature at the North Pole 28 degrees and began the thawing of the North Pole in the middle of the winter when the sun was not even shining there. This is causing the melting of ice, and the land-based ice, both in the Arctic, in places like Greenland, and in the Antarctic, where the largest amount of land ice is found, is beginning to raise sea level. Sea level has been going up because the oceans, when they get warmer, expand in volume, but now, with the melting of these massive amounts of ice at the poles, we are seeing an accelerated sea level rise. These are the cities most at risk because when you measure the size of their populations. There are many populated areas of the Philippines that are at risk from sea level rise. And if you measure the cities at risk in terms of the assets they have at risk, a city in my country, Miami, has $3.5 trillion at risk. It's already happening. Climate Reality had a training program in Miami last fall during the highest of the high tides, and some of the streets of Miami Beach and other cities in South Florida were filled with ocean water. They call it sunny day flooding. This is not rain. It's the ocean coming up through the storm sewers when the high tide comes in. There were fish from the streets swimming in the cities while we were there. This should be a warning to us. And the mayor of that great city speaks for many when he says, this should not be a political issue or a partisan issue. This is a crisis getting worse day by day. We, the people of this planet, have to recognize the consequences of what we are doing and take responsibility for ensuring a brighter and sustainable future. And in poor countries, again, we see areas like the delta of Bangladesh, where so many tens of millions of people live, particularly vulnerable. And we see the salt water flooding into the freshwater aquifers in areas like the Nile Delta in Egypt, threatening agriculture. In the Philippines, this process is projected, according to the Filipino scientists and the global scientific community, to be 2 to 3 times faster than elsewhere, because the ocean waters are heating up more around the Philippines than any place else. The science shows it indisputably, and you can see from this picture how different the ocean to the east of the Philippines is from any place else on Earth. And this has consequences for those who will be asked and encouraged and hopefully assisted to relocate the places where they live as the sea level continues. Human beings are a coastal species, so it's not just the Philippines. All around the world, the percentage of people who live near the coast is extremely high. So we need to prepare, and we need, again, to make the changes that will minimize this disruption and slow down and then halt this catastrophe. Some of the island nations, let me go back one. This clicker is a little too sensitive. I wanted to make the point, without passing it over, that some of the island nations are especially vulnerable. Kiribati is now relocating its entire population. The Maldives had a cabinet meeting underwater to bring the world's attention to their crisis. And of course, we should listen to those who are in the direct line of fire. But we should also calculate the full cost of relying on carbon fuels for the entire world. We have not even talked about ocean acidification. We haven't talked about some of the melting glaciers that are important. And we haven't talked about several of these costs, but they all add up. And one final one I'd like to mention is that the climate crisis is now the #1 threat to the global economy. The World Economic Forum in Davos surveys 750 economists every year. They just concluded the #1 threat to economic stability in the world is the climate crisis. Partly because we have unburnable carbon fuels worth many tens of trillions, $28 trillion, and they're on the books of banks and multinational carbon companies around the world. These are all the carbon fuels we have burned in history. Look at how much of that we have burned in just the last 16 years. But the amount of proven reserves ready to be produced are even larger. This is the amount the scientists say the world could burn and still preserve a chance to save the future of a sustainable civilization on Earth. The amount that's unburnable, $22 trillion worth. This is a threat to the future of the global economy. So again, must we change? Yes, we have a moral imperative. The cost of carbon is unbearable. The threat to our global economy is unbearable. The threat to the web of species is unsurvivable. So yes, we do have to change. We face a critical choice. And if the answer to the first question, must we change, is yes, it leads immediately to the second question, can we change? Here is where the hopeful and exciting news begins. We do have the solutions in hand. The developments are unprecedented. 16 years ago, the best, most accurate at the time projections of what wind energy would grow to by the year 2010 was 30 gigawatts. We have now exceeded that by 14.5 times over. We are seeing the emergence of one of those exponential curves, rapidly and ever faster growing deployment of wind energy, partly because the cost is continuing to come down. In so many regions, it is now cheaper than electricity from coal, and it continues to come down in cost. And it has no pollution, by the way. It doesn't foul the air. This one windmill can supply 6,000 homes. We are now seeing the beginning of the deployment of wind energy in the Philippines and in many other countries. On a global basis, wind could supply not only all the energy the world needs, but 40 times as much of the energy as the world needs. A big industrial country, Germany, one of the most powerful industrial economies in the world. Lots of clouds, very high latitude. One day last December, they got more than 80% of all of their energy for their factories and businesses and homes from solar and wind. If they can do it, others can do it. We are now also seeing the development of batteries that make it possible to use that energy when the wind is not blowing and when the sun is not shining, until it starts shining again and the wind starts blowing again. This is a revolutionary development as well. We're seeing again the reason why is the cost is coming down. Renewable energy is and batteries, one of those areas of technology where the scientists and engineers and investors are able to bring the cost down quickly and rapidly increase the use of these technologies. But the most exciting new technology is solar electricity, photovoltaic energy. The best projections 14 years ago is that the world would annually be able to deploy 1 gigawatt of solar photovoltaics. Well, when the year 2010 got around, we beat that goal by 17 times over. Last year, we beat that goal by 58 times over. This year, we're on track to meet it at least 68 times over. This is a breakthrough. These exponential curves are absolutely astonishing, and they get steeper and grow higher every single year. And it's driven again partly because the cost has been coming down 10% per year for 30 years. It is now becoming cheaper than electricity from burning coal in many, many regions around the world. It is extremely exciting. We're reaching the grid parity point where it's going to displace fossil fuel. Let's talk about grid parity for a moment. What that means is there's a line where the cost of solar electricity becomes cheaper than electricity from coal. Even if you take into account the fact that the sun is not shining all the time, it's still cheaper than coal. Think of it this way. It's a little like the difference between 0 degrees and 1 degree. That's a difference of more than 1 degree. It's the difference between ice and water. And in markets, it's the difference between markets that are frozen up and markets where the capital flows as a liquid into new investments. And that is what is happening now. We've crossed that threshold and the markets are changing. It is the biggest new business and investment opportunity in the history of the world. And most of it is in the private sector. We're now seeing worldwide the investment in new generating capacity and renewables overtake fossil fuels. And the gap is growing year by year. The projections in the future is that that gap will continue to grow as renewables become the dominant source of new electricity. And if they succeed in making nuclear energy cheaper and more and safer and more acceptable, then these projections for the role of nuclear may be too low. But fossil fuels are now losing the competition in the marketplace. I said there are areas of technology where this is true. Is there any precedent we could look at? Well, think for a moment about mobile phones. The largest telephone company in the world in 1980 commissioned a big study from McKinsey. They said, these new mobile phones, you remember the big clunky ones? How many of those might we be able to sell 20 years out in the year 2000? And they conducted this big study and found 900,000. And when 2000 came around, sure enough, they did sell 900,000 phones in the first 3 days of the year. And for the year as a whole, they sold 120 times more. Now there are more than 7.5 billion cell phone connections, more than there are people in the world. So why were these business projections not only wrong, but way wrong? Many have asked that question, why? And the answer comes in 3 parts. First of all, the cost dropped much faster than anybody thought was possible, even as the quality improved much faster than anyone could imagine. But think for a moment about this third factor. The majority of people in the world lived in regions where there were not landline telephone grids. So the people of these low-income nations were excited to leapfrog the old technology and go straight to mobile phones. So as fast as they grew in developed countries, they grew much faster in developing countries. Well, what about the landline grid for electricity? In many parts of the world, it's pretty terrible. And in some parts of the world, it doesn't exist at all. There are more people in the nation of India alone that have no electricity at all than the entire population of the United States of America. 3 times as many people as live in the entire nation of the Philippines with absolutely no electricity at all in India. So now we are seeing the access to electricity provided by cheap solar panels, like this one in Africa on top of a grass hut, and the emergence of new business models like pay-as-you-go solar, so that the cost of installation is incurred by the company selling the panel, and the homeowner or business owner just pays by the kilowatt hour. It's spreading like wildfire. The fastest deployment in the world is in Bangladesh, 2 systems per minute, night and day on average. This is a fantastic development. In Costa Rica, 99% of its electricity now comes from solar and wind, and also hydro. In Chile, this is an inspiring story to me, because this is a country that extends far into the southern latitudes, and they did not have much of a commitment to solar energy as little as 2.5 years ago. And then the following year, they developed 400 megawatts, and by the end of last year, they had increased to more than almost 850 megawatts. But over the next 2 years, they have started construction and signed contracts for these systems in the pipeline. And look at what the nation of Chile is doing. They have seen how good this technology is, how affordable it is, how competitive it is, that it has no pollution to foul the air of their cities, no moving parts, and no fuel cost. You talk about an exponential curve, that is absolutely astonishing. There are many other small nations around the world who are awakening to the revolutionary historic potential of solar photovoltaic energy and wind energy, coupled with the new, more efficient and affordable batteries. This is transforming many countries around the world. The Philippines are now just starting. They are basically at the stage where Chile was 3 years ago. But we're seeing new deployments every day. I was excited to visit this one just a few days ago in Manila. This, of course, is the Vatican, which has announced that it will be the first carbon neutral state. It has 2 advantages. They're very small, and God is on their side. But on a global basis, it's important to remember this. You can go to Wikipedia or any other source you want and check this fact. More energy comes to the earth from the sun every single hour than all of the energy used by the entire global economy in a full year. This is heaven sent. It has no pollution. It has no fuel cost. It has no moving parts in most cases. And it creates jobs. So that is why we're seeing the move to speed this up by reducing the subsidies on oil and coal and gas, and by putting a price on carbon in markets and also in the political system, saying to those who doubt whether reality is reality, no, this is not how we conduct business in free countries. We deal on the basis of facts. And many countries around the world and provinces, like those Canadian provinces and the state of California in my nation, are now putting these policies in place. Chile, by the way, put these policies in place, and that's one of the reasons they were able to take off with their solar deployment so quickly. And the United States is moving with a regulatory system that is extremely effective. Moreover, the United States and the Philippines, which played such a key role, and every other nation agreed in Paris last December to the historic Paris Agreement, that under which every nation has come up with its own plan, and the debate will start within the next 60 days here in the Philippines, and most people support it very strongly. This is a powerful answer to the third question: will we change? It now begins to look powerfully as if the world has made a decision to change. And some of the largest and most powerful nations have now agreed to work together. The two largest and the two largest polluters, the US and China, have now made an agreement to work together in a very positive way. China has now announced that it is putting a nationwide cap-and-trade system in place next year. The European Union already has, many other places have. They are likely to be joined up. Now, it's important to note that China has another motive for doing this, because the air in the cities of China and India and many other countries are made dangerously polluted by the burning of coal. So there is an incentive all around the world to move faster away from coal. The U.S. has been moving fast away from coal. Like the Philippines, the U.S. had a proposal to build all of these new coal plants over the last 10 years. All of these have been defeated. These are the existing plants, all retired. These are the plants where the retirement has been announced. All of these plants are being canceled. And the U.S. is moving very powerfully toward renewable energy. All of the expenditures of new investments for electricity last year, 2/3, almost 3/4 from solar and wind, and almost nothing in coal, 0.01% in coal. Coal is dead in the U.S. as a source of electricity generation. And this is a pattern that is now beginning to spread around the world, not least because people are demanding it. Almost 400,000 people marched in the streets of New York City on the eve of the United Nations Special Session on Climate. Young people particularly are leading the way, including here in the Philippines. So, will we change? Will we realize that this pale blue dot is the place where everything in human history has existed? We're not going to move to some other planet. We couldn't even evacuate New Orleans or Tacloban. We're not going to evacuate the whole planet to some other place in the solar system. This is our home. We must make our stand here. It is now at risk as we see our planet. We understand emotionally that this is our home. Now, in closing, in further addressing that third and final question, will we change? I wish to share with you a line from one of my favorite poets in my own country, Wallace Stevens, who wrote, "After the final no, there comes a yes, and on that yes, the future world depends." Every great moral challenge confronted by humanity, from the abolition of slavery to women's suffrage to civil rights and the ending of apartheid and all the others. Every great moral crusade has confronted a series of no's, one right after the other, until after the final no there came a yes. And on every important moral question, when it is finally resolved into a simple binary choice between what is right and what is wrong, the outcome is foreordained because of what is in our hearts, because of who we are as human beings. This is now a question of what is right and what is wrong. Is it right to save the future for the next generation and those that follow? Of course it's right. Is it wrong to condemn those who come after us to a life of increasing despair and degradation? Of course it's wrong. Can we overcome the inertia, the obstacles, the greed, the self-interest, and every other obstacle that has prevented us from making a choice in favor of what is right? Will we change? That is the question before us. Some still doubt that we have the capacity as human beings. Some doubt that we have the will to act. I believe in my heart that the will to act is itself a renewable resource. Thank you very much.